Сейчас будет выступать Кэрри Фриман. Она является докторкой философии, профессоркой коммуникации в Университете штата Джорджия в Атланте, изучает экологическую коммуникацию, критические исследования животных и медиа, а также стратегическую коммуникацию для активистов. Среди ее книг The Human Animal Earthling Identity, Shared Values, Unifying Human Rights, Animal Rights and Environmental Movements, Framing Farming, Communication Strategies for Animal Rights, а также антология 2015 года Critical Animal and Media Studies. Активистка с 1990-х годов, она руководила студенческими группами по защите прав животных и в настоящее время является советником факультета для своей группы в кампусе. Она является соавторкой Animals and Media.org, руководство по корректному освещению тем, связанных с животными в медиа, а также ведущая
Ethically
радиопередачи
correct
и подкасты о
coverage
природе,
of
включительно
topics related
с
to
2007
animal
года
rights.
на радио Free Georgia.
Also, since
Кэрри работает
2010,
глобальным
she has
продвижением
been
идентичности
hosting a radio show.
Человека-Животного-Землянина посредством
Today,
инклюзивного
she will
формирования общих
present a
ценностей
talk
различных активистских
uh,
кампаний,
promoting a
ценностей.
human-animal earthling
Женщина
identity
делает
via
конференции.
inclusive framing of shared values for all activist campaigns. You're most welcome to share your screen, and you're most welcome to begin, Kari.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored. Also, my dog, Elliot, is back here if you see somebody moving around, although he's very uninterested, ironically, in what we're talking about. Okay, let me share my screen. Put this in
Yes.
presenter mode. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, so I'm talking to you all today basically about my last book, The Human Animal Earthling Identity, part of it, talking about the shared values that all different activist campaigns, progressive activists for human rights, animal rights, and environmentalists, how we can better partner together by having like a shared message about the kind of people we need to be, about having what I'm calling a human animal earthling identity. And so this is what I was going to talk about today, the common goals of supporting humans, other animals, and the environment, a little bit of scholarship on universal values and identity, the solidarity goal of the human animal earthling identity in my book and how that fits critical animal studies goals, the importance of animal rights to human and non-human social movements, and my recommendations for values that foster a human-animal earthling identity. And then how to frame those values biocentrically so that they're inclusive of all living beings and they're not just human-centered in the way we apply our values. And then we have questions and discussion. So starting out with the role of identity and values in achieving the common goals for human and non-human causes. And whenever I mention like three movements, or I'm talking about like human rights or social justice, animal rights, it could be animal welfare too, and then environmental movements. And there's a lot of different types of environmentalism. So I'm starting out with what the problem is in terms of what motivates all these different movements to potentially work together. And I just love this sign that this activist is holding. I mean, honestly, I feel like this really explains a lot. Are we really going to let a bunch of greedy, selfish fools do in this whole planet? Like, that's the question, I think. So this is just a list of a lot of the major problems that we're facing in the Anthropocene, this particular era that we live in. Mass consumption by many humans, and there's still mass inequality and poverty of many more humans at the same time. And a lot of this consumption is causing mass exploitation of living beings, humans and other living beings, for production or profit for economics. And then also it's leading to mass depletion and destruction of the living world, including war being and militarization being part of the destructiveness. And then there's so much pollution and waste that is caused by all of this, and particularly the plastic pollution crisis is a huge one. And then there's unfair prejudices and policies that still limit opportunities and us sharing resources based on discriminatory ideas such as sexism, racism, religious or ethnic biases, classism or caste systems, ableism, homophobia, and then speciesism. So I've got more to add to this list. Couldn't fit it on one slide here. Oops. Hang on a second. Went the wrong way. Here we go. So, of course, global warming being another major life-threatening problem we're all facing. And then it's also creating a refugee crisis for wildlife and for humans as well. Then we have global zoonotic pandemics like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also now we're very worried about bird flu because it's spread around and killing so many animal species besides the human species right now, but it could also take off and become more infectious in humans. Mass incarceration and captivity of living beings worldwide. So whether that's in prisons or farms or research facilities or zoos, so many people are unfairly held hostage. And then the rapid spread of disinformation, that's always been around through the ages, but is made worse in the digital age. Lies that divide us and spread fear. And then the one that really I would probably normally put first is the mass extinction of species and the decline of wild and free-living species. At the same time, the human population is growing and then the wild animal population is decreasing. And this is a graphic that was printed in the Guardian newspaper in 2018 based on a study about the mass of animals on the planet. Now that we have all this technology, they're able to figure out this isn't by numbers, but it's according to kind of the space the animals take up, that of all the mammals on the planet, this is astounding, but 96% of them relate to our species. It's 36% of that is humans. We're a primate. And then 60% of that, I would not use the word livestock, but I would say farmed animals. But in this case, it would be the mammals that we farm, whom we farm. And that leaves only 4% by mass of the mammals on the planet are wild, free-living mammals. And that is astounding because really it should probably be only 4% human mammals and then 96% wild mammals. So this is awful. And then the next graphic that was with that, sometimes my screen is kind of slow to move forward. This graphic is for birds, and it's saying that of all the birds on the planet, according to mass, 70% of those birds are the birds that we are producing for farming and eating. And only 30% of the birds on the planet are wild. And again, I think it should be 100% of the birds on the planet should be wild. So, and this is the study that was from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And so what I have on the side here is just the note that as the population of billions of omnivorous human animals, as that population grows, so does our breeding of farmed animals and then the fishing and hunting of wild animals. And in order to then feed us, if we're going to also continue to eat so many animals, we're also colonizing animal habitats of other animals to grow our farmed animal feed crops and to build human homes and roads and industry that disrupts the lives of wildlife. So this to me is a huge problem. And actually, the book I'm working on now is about coexistence with wildlife, because I think this biodiversity crisis and us not sharing the planet with wild animals, that is, to me, the biggest issue actually that we're facing. Okay, so the solution is for social movements to and causes to join forces around, from human rights to animal rights to environmentalism. And there's lots of reasons to do this. First of all, we all believe in well-being and health and life, and asking humans to be fair to others. We share a common powerful opponent, or opponents, plural, corporations and governments that are exploiting living beings or natural resources are often the opponents that we are working against or trying to reform. And all these movements often work too separately, but we have limited resources. So sometimes we're competing against each other when really we would benefit from a joint cohesive effort to shift cultural values and identity. And this also fits with critical animal studies goals. If you look at like Best's notion of total liberation of species being a goal of critical animal studies, or Pello's phrase socio-ecological inequality, that we're fighting socio-ecological inequality, or Carol Adams and the ecofeminists talking about analyzing mutually reinforcing logics of domination. And I like this quote over here from Glasser, which reflects a lot of what my book is trying to do for activists. She says, "It is possible to have single issue campaigns that are pragmatically focused on one type of exploitation rooted within a specific socio-cultural context, but that still need to ideologically embrace an ethics of intersectionality, embracing the mutually reinforcing nature of oppression, thereby avoiding the exploitation of others." And she's meaning all types of others. So that anyone's campaign, whether it's a human rights campaign or an environmental campaign or an animal rights campaign, can take into consideration how all different types of life, all living beings, are oppressed in by this industry, and work together. So one of the ways to jointly address these interrelated problems I just mentioned is strategically communicating a new human identity. Now, other people have different approaches to social change, but identity is one approach that I really like, and that's about changing the beliefs about who we are and who we care about and what we care about. And I was inspired by this in part by the World Wildlife Fund used to have these change strategists, Crompton and Kasser were their names, and they produced all these different reports, and they often recommended a values-based approach to all social movement campaigns to create a needed shift in cultural identity. Meaning we're not just supposed to tell people statistics about things, or not. Well, they really liked the idea also of priming in humans intrinsic values and benevolent values, like transcendent values. A lot of this draws from the work of Schwartz, which is about cross-cultural or universal values. But they're saying, let's not appeal to people's extrinsic values of just wanting money or being selfish. Let's appeal to things that make us better people, or about building relationships and wellness and kindness types of values. And they have an organization, or Crompton works now at the valuesandframes.org. You can find more about what they're doing now. And then the linguist George Lakoff, who often does a lot of political strategizing, he recommends strategic framing of messages around deep core values and moral visions. And I really like working in that kind of territory, as opposed to just appealing to people's self-interest or just giving a lot of statistics about things. Okay, so we want to have an identity that's less anthropocentric or human-centered. And by that, I mean we're expanding who is in our in-group. And the in-group and out-group is just terms that tend to be used in psychology. And so over here on the left-hand side of the screen, values are just defined as enduring beliefs that we have, but they influence our identity, and our identity is who we say we are based on who we belong with, what groups we belong with, and our in-group. So one of the problems is that we as humans often consider nature and non-human animals, other animals, as an out-group. And so a solution would be incorporate them into our in-group. And you can call this lots of different things, but Susan Clayton uses the term environmental identity. There's also a new term now called eco-cultural identity by Tema Milstein and Jose Castro Sotomayor, eco-cultural identity. But an environmental identity is a sense of connection to some part of the non-human natural environment and the belief that the environment is important to us. So we feel interdependent and we feel a sense of similarity. And studies have shown that an environmental identity increases people's pro-environmental behaviors, and it increases their belief that non-human animals, other animal species, have rights, that other species' interests should be included in decision making. So my feeling is if we can't get people around the world to see themselves as part of the animal kingdom, and to really care about other animals and not think of humans as so much more important than other animals, we're always going to put ourselves first and then put them second or last. And then we're just going to continue to exacerbate the problems that we have. So the goal of my book, The Human Animal Earthling Identity, is to identify values that activists can promote that are foundational to fostering and framing a more inclusive identity, more life-centered, more altruistic, more caring. And I'm referring to this as a human animal earthling identity. And so, and part of that goal would be that our in-group then becomes all of humanity. That's inclusive of all races and demographic groups, ethnic groups, and then all animals. So the whole animal kingdom is our family, our kin. And then all earthlings, to note that we are one species among many sharing a home planet, that this is not just a human planet. Because I think that's what our stories in the media tell us, is that we're the only animals with any stories or any meaning, as if none of the other species on the planet even matter. So we have to start recognizing that we're one species among many. And my hope is if we adopted a human animal earthling identity, that this expanded sense of self on an individual level would foster human cultures on a societal level that are inherently fairer and more sustainable towards all living beings and part of our global community. So even though I'm approaching something by saying we should change individuals, which is kind of a difficult thing to do considering there's billions of us. The idea is that if lots of individuals adopted this type of identity, then they would have a critical mass at influencing the culture at large. Okay, well, who can get started on this project? I like to work with social movements or activists or these nonprofit groups across all different causes because they're moral entrepreneurs of society. They try to get change happening. So it seems like a natural place to start. But we could also work with people in the media, could promote this identity. Teachers and schools could promote this identity, religious institutions. So you could take this in different directions. I chose to focus on social movement groups. And Before I get started in talking about what I found in my book, I just wanted to say part of the book has a literature review. There's really like 3 chapters of literature review about the philosophical places where we all overlap in social justice philosophy, animal rights philosophy, and environmental philosophies or ethics. And to simplify it, we're all asking humans to be fair, to be peaceful, and to be respectful towards others. Okay, well, who are those others? Usually living sentient beings, but also nature, including plants, and then just our shared natural resources, which could be water and air and other things like that. Okay, so if we just look at the living sentient beings part, the animal rights movement and the human rights movement really focus on living sentient beings because they're both anti-instrumental movements. So they're against objectifying anyone being a sentient individual and using him or her as a means to an end, as an instrument or a tool. And they all promote emancipation from oppression. And they're pro well-being. They care about the well-being of all these sentient individuals. And then looking at the environmental movement, they focus on all of this, but they tend more to focus on the nature and the shared natural resources. So they protect all species and habitats from human excess and exploitation and pollution, but they usually privilege groups or species over individuals, unless the individual is an endangered species, a member of an endangered species, or an individual is human. So that latter privilege that the environmental movement gives to humans isn't really an unjustified privilege, especially since many humans are very destructive, and you could say that we're overpopulated because we are a primate, and like basically as a primate, we're on all continents, we're in cold regions, on islands, and we're everywhere. So unless all animals have privileges as sentient beings, which is what animal rights says, it doesn't really make sense that we would privilege the rights of just one type of animal, which is humans, especially when we're the most destructive animal or the most invasive animal. So actually, in a way, animal rights protects human rights, at least within an environmental perspective where we're trying to limit or curb destructiveness of species for the well-being of the greater good. And so this is just kind of a simplified model of what I would say is more of an ideal relationship between the human animal and other animals on the planet, where you see that humans are part of the animal kingdom. We're not in a separate bubble out here somewhere else. And then we're all within this bigger ecosystem of plants and nature. And so, and I'm noting off to the side here that because my ideal relationship does not include domesticated animals, us purposely making animals dependent on us, there's not a category where there's like a small group of other animals within the human category or whatever. In this case, all humans are all humans are within the animal category. And then all animals are within the larger category of kind of all species. So these different groups work on a lot of these different types of individuals, but animal rights is in the middle. And so I do see this as a vital bridge connecting the notion of nature and culture, because of course culture used to mean just human culture, but now we know that other animals have cultures, or just this notion of the human and the non-human. Okay, well then all of this is non-human, but we are part of the animal kingdom too. So there's really kind of no getting around animal rights. I mention this because I know a lot of us care so much about all kinds of animal species. And But the human rights movement and the environmental movement often would leave other animals out if they're not like endangered animals or they weren't our domesticated animals. So I do think members of the critical animal studies field and animal rights oriented activists are important to reminding these other movements that animals need to be protected. And I'll just mention quickly, I don't have in my presentation many quotes from the people I interviewed in my book, but I thought this quote was really a good one in terms of why there's solidarity across all different types of causes. This is Eric Pica from the group called Friends of the Earth. And he says, all three of us are fighting against this system that's built on exploitation, whose main purpose and goal is to turn people and things and animals into commodities that are meant to be kind of used and abused, then thrown away for this ever-growing, for this ever-insatiable appetite for profit and wealth concentration. He was being really direct. Yeah. So that's part of the ugliness of the economic system that we're in. And then here's some quotes from Laurel Sutherland, who works at the Rainforest Action Network. And he was just noting that we have so many things in common. That there's if you start with a commitment for justice, equity, and ecological health, you come to the same conclusion about how animals, people, and landscapes should be treated. And he thinks the three causes are inextricable and they're really just one movement. And so getting more into my book project here, I was seeking ways that the campaign messages of all three social movement causes, human rights, animal protection, and environmentalism, can support each other as interconnected allies by identifying our shared values and framing those shared values in biocentric or life-centered ways to expand who they apply to. Meaning, if someone says, I care about fairness, that fairness can't just be for people, for men, or for your own race, or for your own species. It needs to be fairness for everyone. And this is a picture I took in Atlanta of a forest that we unfortunately were not able to save, a part of the forest that was cleared away to build a kind of military policing training center. It's a big issue in Atlanta. So in terms of my research methods for my book, I used two methods. I analyzed the values and campaign messages on websites. So I did a content analysis of 16 global social movement organizations. And so these are the organizations here. And then I also interviewed activists from these groups and some other activists. In today's presentation, I'm really not talking about the activist interviews, but they feature a lot in the book. And the book also goes through, has a chapter on each of these things, and it's really interesting to think more about what each group is doing and how they're appealing to different values in the process. But I'm going to skip towards the end and just go to the recommendations chapter and tell you where all the values overlapped. So that I basically looked at, what kind of values do human rights groups promote, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Minority Rights Group? What kind of values are they promoting in their campaigns? Okay. Then I'm looking at the animal protection groups like PETA, World Wildlife Fund, Sea Shepherd, International Fund for Animal Welfare. What kind of values are they appealing to? They're assuming that we care about. And then environmental groups, what kind of values do they appeal to? Like Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, Oceana, Rainforest Action Network, groups like that. I'm not going to get in this presentation into the differences between the groups. At this point, I'm kind of bringing it all together, but the distinctions are in the book. But I also want to mention that a lot of this is probably skewing Western, because even though these are all supposed to be global or international social movement organizations, because I'm reading their websites in English and they are mainly English speaking, I do think that it's skewed, even though we're saying it's global, it's skewing more towards Western issues. So I'm about to share values that are befitting a human, animal, earthling identity. So I took those list of 3 different long list of values, and I looked at where they overlapped. And there was a lot of places where they overlapped. So I was just saying these are things we all are trying to promote in society, we all care about. And it's actually quite a long list. And you don't keep by this I'm going to show. And if you want to see this list, it's available on the humananimalEarthlings.com website. So I have a website for my book where you can see this list. So, okay, so I split them into 4 categories just to organize them. The first category are values that relate to life. And so the things that all the groups support that relate to life are agroecology and sustainable crop farming, biological diversity, caretaking, like helping others in need, health and well-being, saving lives, the notion of livelihoods, that people need to and others need to take care of themselves and have the resources they need, naturalness, peace and nonviolence, protection, and this could be of many things, of living beings, ecosystems, vulnerable beings, restoration and healing, safe, secure, and clean habitats or places to live, sanctuaries and reserves support life, and then having a stable climate supports life. And then the next category of values are fairness values. So coexisting with each other, cultural diversity and inclusion, democratic decision-making and people power, equality or equity, fairness and justice, freedom, like freedom over a sentient being's body, speech, mobility, labor, and life choices, legal protection and enforcement by the government for laws, reparation for harm, like making up or compensating for harms. Respect, of course, is a big one. Respect for humans, other animals, and nature. Rights for sentient individuals and ecosystems. The notion of sharing with fellow beings. Territory and land rights. Access to meaningful, traditional, or vital spaces. And this is especially important in the context of indigenous rights. And then wildness and nature, freedom from unwanted domestication. Okay, I have 2 more categories, and the next category is responsibility. And so these are all values that relate to responsibility. Accountability, especially for harmful actions. We need to be responsible, take responsibility, and do what's right. Careful and wise actions of like following a precautionary principle and avoiding unnecessary risks. Collective action, working together to solve problems. Conscientious consumption, we talk a lot about this in critical animal studies, which is like trying to eat and wear vegan and cruelty-free, but includes not wearing sweatshop clothing and promoting a living wage and promoting fair trade. Educating anyone is a responsible thing to do, children and adults, raising awareness. Empowering others, and particularly if there are marginalized groups in your society, empowering their voices. Engage political citizenship, commitment to causes. Integrity, moral integrity, and authenticity of research information, meaning that what we're promoting and the statistics we use need to be accurate. Investment in a sustainable future, making long-term ecologically responsible policies and practices. And we value productivity, meaning that when we enact solutions, they're going to be effective, so we're not wasting our time. They value speaking out and challenging abuses of power, peaceful protest. They value the sustainable and wise use of natural resources, and then truth-telling and transparency. And then the last category is unity. And so these are maybe things that bring us together. Biocentrism, a focus on life. The notions of community, compassion, and empathy for sentient beings. a notion of dignity, and that can be for sentient beings as well, all of us to maintain our self-respect. Notions of family, harmony and cooperation, humility. I kind of added this one in because I think more humans need humility to be humble. Love and friendship, the social bonds, or biophilia, the love for nature. Inclusivity and openness to bringing others in. The notion of interdependence. We have economic interdependence, ecological, social interdependence, joining together in solidarity, and promoting understanding. Okay, that was a very long list. Okay, so now that we know what are some of the values that all these social movements have in common, how could we frame them or talk about them in ways that are more biocentric and they are inclusive of the more than human world? And so that was a term that was brought up earlier today, the more than human world. So these are some of the recommendations from my study. Oh, I'm just bringing this back up again to say that, just reminding us that we're trying to promote a less human-centered, more environmental identity and the values in doing that. And I'm going to get to talking about some language here, and that was also what Dr. Akampora was recently talking about in his talk. So how to frame things in biocentric ways rather than anthropocentric ways. We want to blend similarity and diversity in our rhetoric. So with similarity, we want to show that there's some biological kinship with other animals, that we share a lot of things in common with them. When we're literally related to them, we share DNA. And like I don't know where here's my dog. We both sneeze, and like we get hungry and we have to go to the bathroom. Like we think about things, feelings, like we have a lot of things in common. But then there's diversity. We still need to appreciate diversity among species and among individuals. And we don't want to require other animals to be like us or be more human in order to deserve respect. I also wanted to draw attention to Melanie Challenger's book, if you haven't read it, called How to Be Animal. And I did a podcast on my In Tune to Nature podcast interviewing her. And I really think this is a fantastic book. And she uses such great language. Like she talks about we need to refresh the loveliness of being animal. So because I'm always saying we need to embrace our animality. And so she's talking about that in this book. And she's also mentioning that many of the things that we most value, like our relationships and eating a good meal and the pleasure of springtime, these are things that are demonstrably animal. Like instead of thinking of the animal as the worst things about us, like, oh, you're a monster. If you're an animal, you're violent. Actually, it's about family. Like some of the best things about us are because we're animal. And so we need to start talking about that. So here's some examples of taking some of the values that are part of the human, animal, earthling identity values and then applying them to all living beings. So like when we talk about life-saving, we usually think about human lives, but you can also talk about life-saving in terms of salmon or old growth forests and trees. When we talk about health and well-being, that can be the emotional well-being of injured hawks at a sanctuary. It could be taking your companion animal, like my dog Elliot, to the vet for vaccinations. And it could be maintaining the health and cleanliness of a wetland. And there's also the One Health movement, if you've heard of that. I think that's very promising for animal protection because it's a public health movement, but it says that human public health won't happen if we don't care about the environment and the well-being of other animals. So it recognizes the one health of all species. So that's very positive. Or the notion of family. We can keep families together who are refugees if they're seeking asylum somewhere. We can keep families of elephants together in a reserve. And we could avoid separating families of domesticated cats or cows in human care. Love and friendship, that's not just something that humans have, that there's interspecies friendships and there's social bonds that form and make life worth living for all social animals. We all want to choose who we hang out with. And this is just a few more examples of this, but I also wanted to say this picture I took up here is a wild orca in the Pacific Northwest who I was lucky to see when I was out there. So, okay, reparation for harms. There's many, there's so many ways we need to repair the harms that we've caused. So that could be giving Indigenous people land rights. We could repair harms for humans who were enslaved or imprisoned. We can rewild forests and regenerate forests. We could remove dams from rivers. We could clean up toxic mining sites. We can try to cleanse pollutants from the air and the atmosphere. And with whales, we could take them out of the tanks that they're in at these aquarium and try to have a seaside sanctuary, like Dr. Lori Marino is trying to work on with her whale sanctuary project, which is actually in Canada. They're trying to build a sea pen sanctuary for whales. The notion of freedom, we usually think about it for humans like free speech, but it could be freedom of mobility for bears to migrate between parks and not get hit by cars or get killed by hunters. Freedom for goats not to be kept and bred and killed or milked for food. Livelihood is a phrase we usually refer just to humans and our ability to have a job and make money, but we can think of livelihood as all animal species are trying to survive and they need to have their certain resources like trees and healthy air and water in order to be able to make a living for themselves. And then equality, that can be treating others the way you want to be treated, like the golden rule, and coming up with some similar standards for the way we treat non-human animals, other animals, the more than human world, just as you would treat fellow humans. And then this gets to something that Dr. Akampora was just talking about, that the language we use matters in terms of a human, animal, earthling identity. I think it's important for us to remind other people as much as possible that we are also, that as humans, we're also animals. So you can see in this sign that I have over here, there's Elliot again. I use the term fellow animals, like protect all humans, fellow animals, and nature. And this sign, by the way, was a sign that I put together when Trump first got elected in like 2017, when there was a women's march. And unfortunately, he got elected again. And so I had to bring out this sign again for a recent hands-off march that we just had last weekend. So good thing I kept that sign. Okay, so just going through this really quickly because it's repeating some of what Dr. Akampora was saying. You don't want to say humans and animals as if they're two separate groups. You want to say like humans and fellow animals, or animals including humans or other animals. But we do need to acknowledge that the term animal itself, when applied to humans, can be offensive given its racist and insulting uses historically. So it's probably better to refer to your own group or your own self as an animal and let other humans self-identify because of the fraught nature of the word animal. And the word non-human animal, if saying non-human animal or other than human animal or more than human world, if that's awkward, you could also just put a disclaimer in your paper that says every time you say animal, you do want to acknowledge that humans are part of the animal kingdom. I mean, I prefer to use terminology every time that reminds us, but some people prefer to just have a disclaimer that says when I use the animal term, this is what I mean. And then it's important for us not to use the word it or some inanimate pronoun when referring to other animals, and to refer to them as they or he or she or something gendered. And I'm not going to go through this whole list, but this was in my book. And it was similar to what Dr. Akampora was talking about. Just I was coming up with or talking about terms for when we need to, over on the right-hand side, talk just about humans, or we want to talk about all animals but exclude humans, or when we want to talk about all of us together, all animals, or on the left-hand side here, when we're just talking about everybody on Earth, what kind of language that do we want to use? So some of the terms we were just talking about, like other animals, could be a way to talk about all animals besides humans, fellow animals, and you could mention whether you're talking about species or individuals. Animals besides humans, animals except humans. You could say non-human animals. Other animal cultures, other animal societies, other animal communities. And I have the animal term in here from Kemmerer. And then when we're talking about all of us, we can just refer to us all as animals, or we could say everyone, we, cultures, individual. We could even say the word people to mean all people include other animal species because they're persons. Now, that is not a common way we normally refer to them. So, but I try to, when I'm referring to the human species, is I try to, oh, I'm sorry if this is coming up on your screen. Let me move this out of the way. When I try to not refer to human species as people, but refer to us as humans in case other animals get legal personhood status. I wanted them to be able to be called persons and people as well. And this is in my book, and I also have a new chapter on language in this eco-linguistics handbook that's going to be coming out. So I'm wrapping up the presentation, but I also wanted to mention there's terms we can use kind of for our movement about bringing everybody together. We can call it coalitions or alliances. We can say we're serving as allies. We can call this intersectional activism, multidimensional activism. We could say we're working towards total liberation of species, groundless solidarity for everyone, or the term interspecies justice is something that I like to use a lot now. And then just wrapping up with just some of the comments from some of the people I interviewed in the book. Ingrid Newkirk of PETA says that each movement's arguments should bolster the other as we move towards a mutual goal. And then Will Travers of the group Born Free, and this is also Mustafa Ali of the Hip Hop Caucus, had both said that we should be willing to reframe messages in ways that are more agreeable to other social causes with messages that are more inclusive. So that when we're putting something together for like a vegan campaign, we should also think about it from a human rights and environmental perspective and not just kind of from an animal perspective. So we're supporting everybody. And for sake of time, I won't go through all of these, but in my book, I have these 13 common causes that are project areas that all social movements could work on together, from democratic reform or economic reform to clean, healthy environments, the climate movement, redesigning urban areas so they're more animal friendly, making sure we're moving away from violent masculinity and we're empowering ethnic minority groups and females to be leaders in the world, indigenous land rights and stewardship, and abolition of enslavement of anyone or unfair imprisonment. So these are ways that different movements could pick one or two of these things and build coalitions around them. Oh, and so this is just my last slide that has my email address on it, and then my website for my book that has some of the stuff that I showed you today is on there. And then I also have a podcast where I interview a lot of activists, and it's called In Tune to Nature. And you can often find that on streaming platforms or on YouTube, or I have a website where I post my podcasts. So that's it. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, dear Kэрри, for wonderful presentation. Я думаю, что сейчас у нас могут быть вопросы у слушательниц. Ralph?
We may now have certain questions from our listeners. Maybe.
Ralph, you can ask question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Ralph.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful stuff. And I have to now get my hands on your book, and I could see that I'm going to want to use at least, and especially the last chapter, because in my environmental ethics and animal ethics classes, we almost always reach a point somewhere in the discussion when someone says some comment like, well, we have to look after our concerns or whatever. And I say, our? Who's that? Who's the we? And then we talk about all the permutations possible within humanity and beyond humanity. And I wanted to pass on to you a thing that I found very helpful. It's an article that appeared in the New York Times. They have a philosopher's stone, it's called, a column for philosophy. And in 2015, I'm forgetting the author, but the title is Why I Identify as Mammal. And the author there is trying to take the steps beyond humanity, but was also arguing that he thinks that it's we shouldn't go further out because he thinks it hollows out our commonality once we have an earthling identity or something like that. So he's at once uplifting and also challenging or criticizing your model. So I think you want to have a look at it or at some point in the game. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, you definitely could argue with this human animal earthling identity that it's too broad, that it's like it's almost having no identity if we identify with everyone in our in group. But it's also that I feel like probably a lot of us already have this, and you probably have it, and I have it.
Yeah.
Like we already are doing this, but we do pick and choose sometimes when certain parts of our identity are more pertinent to a situation.
Yes.
Then like sometimes you're just identifying as a human family member, and sometimes you're identifying with the nation that you're from. And so it doesn't mean that you don't have multiple identities. But I wonder sometimes, like even in what to call ourselves, if like sometimes I'll say human animal, but that's actually kind of an odd term because you don't say dog animal and turtle animal.
Yeah.
But it's just something we do to try to remind other people that we're animals. But yeah, I think saying that I'm a mammal is useful. A lot of times I'll say I'm a primate or a great ape. Now that's getting a lot more specific.
Yeah.
I do like to make the mammal analogy when I'm talking. A lot of us do vegan advocacy. And when I'm talking about the dairy industry, especially since I'm female, I will say, I am a mammal. I could be milked. I could be impregnated. Someone could take my babies and then hook me up to a machine and steal my milk. So, whereas I can't really say that same analogy with chickens and birds. But so I think sometimes the fact that we are a mammal is appropriate. But I also wouldn't want to privilege mammals over birds and reptiles because we already do that, as we know. Like we tend to protect marine mammals and we don't protect fish, for example. So I guess I would hesitate to I don't want to reinforce a notion that mammals are more important than birds or invertebrates or other species.
Yeah. It reminds me that Tom Reagan, for instance, originally his case for animal rights is just about mammals and whether he took a lot of heat for that being limiting and something of that sort. And then the other thing I'm reminded of is the film that came out, I want to say 15 years ago or something like that, Earthlings. It's a very good animal studies, animal ethics film to take a look at. And it's narrated by Joaquin Phoenix.
Oh yeah, I show part of that Earthlings documentary in my class, but only the beginning part, because the Earthlings documentary is, as you know, it's gross. It's disgusting because they show everything,
Yeah.
all the cruelty of so many industries.
Yes.
Like it's a horror movie, basically, but it's true. But there is the part in the beginning is great because that's when they use that Harry Bestien quote saying that
other nations.
These animals are other nations, and like they're building the case for why we're all interconnected.
And it
so
returns to that at the end.
Okay,
you're right in,
but then the
in
middle
between.
Part is so, although we do need to see behind the curtain of what we're legally doing to other animals, but I do think maybe it's a bit much in it, because if we make people too offended, they won't even watch. So it's like we're always, as activists, trying to show them the harsh reality of what we're doing to animals, but not so gross that they close their eyes.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to figure out how much to show of the harsh reality.
Yeah.
Oh, is it Dimitri? I see your hand up.
Большое спасибо за такой чудесный
Thank you
доклад.
very much for this amazing presentation. And I would like to excuse myself for the question which I'm presenting. It doesn't reflect my values, but it reflects my experience as the ecologist and person working in social advocacy. As of now, I'm working as an anthropologist. And I would like to allude to the first part of your presentation, because I may be mistaken, but if we're talking about domestication of plants and animals, it's not just precisely, not exclusively humane domain of activity, because if we look at the so-called lesser animals, such as insects, if we talk about ants are farming mushrooms. Ants are also essentially farming and milking other insects. And I do not really know whether ants think in categories of domestication, but we do see the exploitation of one species directed at the other, and it feels like almost like a domestication, because ants are milking a very particular subset of insects, and it's not a symbiosis. And therefore, for instance, ants preserve these particular subset of insects and defend them from other insects, and which we see in human experience as we defend cows from wolves or foxes. But if we also can look at the case of crabs, which essentially domesticate actinias in their claws, and we also can see almost cases which are genocide-like, when, for instance, one ant house is attacking, essentially carrying out a military operation aimed at other ants, and then they're growing, and then they're nurturing ants whom they conquered as essentially slaves. And if we think about predatory birds and predatory mammals, we see examples of different types of relations towards species which may be rendered as a food for a predator. And the relation differs, and this difference is spatial in its nature. So, for instance, there is a predator and there is a species which may be rendered as food, and one of those species is located closer to the predator and one is further, and the one located further away would be perceived as the essentially food bank for the predator. And the way the spatial relation is unfolding is somewhat unclear, but there is a clear spatial distinction. And I give those examples which may be interpreted as quasi-cultural or pre-cultural domestication of animals. And if we come back to human, this agricultural domestication may be interpreted as something we have inherited from animals as our ancestors, but in a hyperbolic sense, because in our case, domestication is of catastrophic scale, and it is perceived, and it should be perceived, as almost genocidal farming of cows or chicken. If, for instance, we can compare it with the amount of domestication undertaken by ants. And truth be told, human species is overextended if seen in comparison with other species. But maybe this problem may be solved in the following manner. Maybe we can downsize with a non-violent actions aimed at limiting and downsizing the amount of human species. I ask you to excuse me for making such a non-legally binding statement, but perhaps the notion of this global domestication would lessen over the time if we lessen the amount of human population. Dalai Lama, several years ago, noted in interviews that developing countries such as Russia and China would have to agree on the non-violent reduction of the amount of population. And do you think that such an option actually exists for us? Because as we as species domesticate other species and has such a horrendous, and it took such a horrendous shape. But do you think that it is viable for us to follow this path of non-violent reduction of the human populace? And do you think that it may become one of the new human values, because there is an overabundance of us as humans, and I think that through interstitial agreement we are to regulate it. Dmitry, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but we have to follow the strict timing. Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dmitry. You've really thought about this very deeply. And I love that you're thinking about this at an ecological level and comparing our species with so many other species. First of all, to the human population issue, some of the environmental movements are talking about it, like the Center for Biological Diversity talks about it. And then there's some organizations, I think it's called Human Connection, that are dealing with stabilizing the human population or decreasing it, but in nonviolent ways. Like one of the best ways is to empower women around the world. So that is, because that, I do think that is true, that our human population is out of sync with the rest of the world. And again, as a particular kind of mammal, we don't need to be everywhere like we are. But we want a nonviolent solution to that. And it does seem the best way to do that is policies that promote female empowerment and leadership naturally reduce the number of children that women have. So I do think that more nonprofit groups should be brave enough to talk about the fact that the human population growth is too much and it's beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, given how much we want to consume. So but people are afraid to have that conversation because then they think it's misanthropic or it sounds like we hate humans. So, but it's really just a realistic notion. But we also have to recognize that every human does not have the same impact on the planet, because some humans, like us in the United States, use a lot more energy and resources and pollution, than others. And to your first point that you're making, that reminds me of my dissertation, and my first book was called Framing Farming. and it was all about vegan advocacy, vegetarian advocacy. And I came up with the little slogan, "It's unfair to farm anyone." It's unfair to farm anyone, or don't farm anybody, because I really was saying you don't see that in most of the natural world, but especially among mammals, you don't see other species breeding and controlling and then deciding when they're going to kill other species like we do. Now, I did make an exception for ants and insects because, as you mentioned, the ant cultures are like mind-boggling. They do all kinds of stuff, and I don't even know all the things that they're doing. So I had to kind of set aside some of the insect communities as being an exception to that rule. So I think that's important to say. But of course, just because one or two animal species does something, that doesn't mean that it's therefore it's natural and we all should do it. But it's safe to say that the vast majority of animals who eat other animals do not farm those animals. They hunt those other animals as prey. And that at least is more fair to those other prey animals to have a chance to escape. Because what we're doing is completely unfair, and we're just breeding and controlling females of a species, and then taking their children and their bodies, their eggs, their fur, their skin and everything. And we're just controlling everything about it. So to me, that is just unfair. And it doesn't matter to me whether it's done in a small scale or in a large scale. It's still not respecting the freedom or interests of that individual who's being farmed. So that's the way that I talk about it. But most people talk about it, as you mentioned, Dimitri, that where they are just against factory farming, and that we just have we've taken the notion of farming and then just with capitalism, we've just exploded it into something that is massive and just totally unsustainable. And that's true too. So I think, like, talking about forming alliances with other groups, a lot of us, and in the animal rights movement, we're vegans. And so we don't want to promote any farming or fishing or hunting. I would make an exception for people who don't have anything else to eat. If humans actually needed to be omnivorous to survive, I think they should be. But I don't think we should farm anyone. But if we want to form alliances with like some human rights groups and some environmental groups, we often have to not just talk about veganism, but get to that factory farming, that large industrial farming, and focus on that. It doesn't mean that we're giving up on our veganism, but if you want to join forces, there are a lot of groups who do not like industrial farming. And if we got rid of industrial farming, that would mean there wouldn't be that many farmed animals, and the products would cost a lot more, and people would naturally not use them as much. So I do think from a pragmatic standpoint, if we were able to put a moratorium on building any more industrial sized farms, or we outlawed that, then that would drastically reduce the amount of animals that are even farmed, and that would make it easier for us to like move in the direction. But right now, farmed animal products are cheap. And in our country, they're subsidized by taxes. And so it seems like it's cheaper to eat animals than it is to be vegan, which it shouldn't be. So there's some economics involved in that.
Thank you, Kэрri, for answer. Thank you. I think other for questions. And I think if Patrice agree with it, we have last question. Patrice, is that okay for you?
Да, Антонин, но, может быть, перед этим мы можем отпустить переводчиков.
Antonina, I think we can let go of the interpreters because I can ask my question in English.
Спасибо большое за
Because our session is officially over. Thank you very much for interpretation. We will continue in English exclusively without interpretation.
ask the last question, but we are already very late, but still, Kari, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm looking forward to read your work very much. And just one very kind of like, it's a short question regarding pedagogy, education, and this identity. What do you see? Maybe you have had this research in your book, or you have talked with educators. How is it represented, this earthling identity, teaching of this earthling identity in some maybe teaching materials, courses? Yeah, that would be my question.
Oh, Ayana, that is a great idea for me to develop and then to put on my website, which for some reason I had not thought of, was, yeah, how do you translate some ideas from the book and then put them into practice? I mean, it could be that like you could have students like either read a particular book or watch a movie or read news stories, and then ask them to what extent do you see, you know, an affiliation between humans and other animals and humans as part of the whole ecosystem? How is that reflected in that news story or that book? And to what ways is it reflected? And more often, it's not reflected at all. And then you could ask the students, how could it be? Like if you rewrote this news story, if you changed this film, how could you add this in? Or even just simplifying it to say like a biocentric perspective, like a life-centered perspective that doesn't take the human and make the human the central point of everything, and that all concerns are about and for humans. Can we at least say that we're trying to look at all different life? Like I used to have this idea that it would be great to have a whole channel, like a Netflix, but just for biocentric programming. And it could be news channels, and it could be situation comedies, and it could be romantic comedy movies, documentaries, like all kinds of genres of media could be there. But what's different about it is that they're taking the human animal earthling identity or more of a biocentric perspective on anything. And when like they're reporting the news, they're not just talking about the news according to how humans are affected by things humans are doing. They're thinking about how other animals are affected. Like anytime you talk about a road being built, that road is guaranteed going to kill other animals. And now it might also kill humans as well, but that road will definitely cause other animals to die. And what if we acknowledge that every time there was a road built, or that we're destroying habitats when we build a new development? Or just the idea that like when people are complaining in areas like in the United States and you have in Russia, you have bears and we have bears. People get very upset when the bears like come into their neighborhood or get near their trash can or their bird feeder or something. And it's like humans don't want to change our behavior. But the better way of framing the news is more like you moved into their neighborhood or we destroyed their neighborhood and now they're kind of forced closer to us. And so you're going to interact with them. We can't just have the authorities remove the bears from human cities or places or towns or developments. So like if we had, could we look more equally at a situation? And that's true coexistence. So I'm really interested in the notion of how are we coexisting with other animals? So that may be a phrase too that you could say, could the students examine anything from the perspective of promoting coexistence, a shared life among different species? That's a great idea, though. Thank you.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kari.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here.